Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's mid-course webinar for the 2024 Specialist Masterclass. As we wait for more participants to trickle in, I just want to invite you to participate in this little pre-session activity at the link that you see both on the screen, and it should also be shared in the chat now. This will be part of our icebreaker activity in a moment, so please do fill in 1 or 2 words to describe your thoughts on generative AI, the theme of our Specialist Masterclass. We also invite you, as more participants trickle in, to introduce yourselves in the chat. So share your name, your project location, years, where you're joining from today. My name is Anna Chiriani Dean. I was a fellow in Armenia in 2019-2020. I'm the Learning and Development Manager for English Language Programs at Georgetown University, and I'm calling in from Seattle, Washington today, where it's nice and rainy as usual. Supporting our webinar today, we also have Specialist Outreach Coordinator Ben Taylor, who you'll see in the chat, our IT Projects Manager Katie Subra, and we're also joined by Tony Newman, the Global Program Officer for the Specialist Program at ECA, as well as a few members of our Specialist Masterclass course development team, Katie Naginski and Stephanie Hansen. And you'll probably see a few other familiar faces from our wonderful Georgetown University English Language Programs team. So before we dive in and hear from our presenters, you don't want to hear from me the whole time, Jeff and Elizabeth, I'll go over just a couple of basic webinar reminders. So today we have enabled the Q&A function of Zoom so that you can ask questions there throughout the webinar, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. So please add any questions that you have to that Q&A. You'll see a button at the bottom of your screen. Please raise your virtual or on camera hand if you'd like to participate verbally at any point or participate through the chat and the reactions feature. We'd love to see you engaged in the chat and the reactions throughout this. Make sure that when you're in a breakout room, you share the airspace. Make sure there's enough time for everybody to contribute. And of course, be professional and courteous at all times. So without further ado, I would love to get going and pass it on over to Jeff and Elizabeth.
Hi, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the course. We're excited to finally do this. It's been great talking to everybody through the chat section and the comment section of the course, but getting a chance to interact live is great. I'm Jeff Kuhn from Ohio University, and I've done 6 specialist visits. My first one was in Venezuela. My most recent one was the Dominican Republic, and I've been fortunate to do 2 virtual specialist projects as well.
Hello, I am Dr. Elizabeth Plummer, and I was a fellow in South Africa, and I've been a specialist in a number of places, virtual and in-person. Last year I did an in-person project in Vietnam, and I'm currently doing a virtual project in Russia, and I love to ride roller coasters. So today we are going to start with our course song that Jeff has helped us create. Then Jeff and I are going to give some course trends and updates that we've seen throughout the first 3 sessions. And then we're going to have a group discussion, and we'll have a final Q&A at the end of the session. So if you have any questions, make sure you're putting that in the Q&A function. So as opposed to putting it in the chat, put those questions in the Q&A function, and at the end, we're going to answer as many as we can. So without further ado, are we ready for our course song?
Yeah, we're going to see what happens here. So one of the things we did with that little icebreaker when we asked everybody to drop in a couple of words about AI is, so as you've been filling out that form, I've been dropping it into what's called Suno AI, so a bit of software that lets you create music through AI. So let's jump over to it. We'll take a look. I'm going to go in here and we'll see how this goes here. So here it is. So I drop everything in here. You can see up here in the top corner are the words people have been putting in. And so I'm just going to click create. And you can see it's going to start just like churning through everything. And as it does, you can see now it's created this song, and we'll give it a listen here.
Artificial intelligence, transformative, scary, spooky, awestruck, questionable, exploratory, complex, futuristic, futuristic, wonderful, truly amazing,
Little hit and
curious,
miss.
untrustworthy, inspirational, overwhelmed.
And you know, it's one of the fun things about this song.
Ooh, now we're getting a little bit change of the music.
I'll place this in the threads there. But one of the things I think it's kind of fun with this is, you know, one of those things we can think about with AI after last week's kind of, you know, I hate to say doom and gloom session, but with AI, you know, thinking about the ways it can amplify what students are able to do. You know, students who aren't maybe musically inclined can now write music. You know, students who aren't necessarily poetic can start to shape poetry. So, you know, ways that we can think about AI to like bump up our abilities. I can play the radio. That's all I can do musically. But being able to do things like this opens up some doors for some creative possibilities. And so I'll share these into the courses so everybody can like listen to our song. And I'll have it write some lyrics. It takes a little bit longer to turn out some lyrics, but I'll have it write some and I'll post them in the comments too. But with that in mind, we'll kind of jump into the courses and everything that we've been seeing over the past few weeks. And Elizabeth's going to go from there.
Yeah, I like Christy, who says teachers who are not musical can make music for their class. Fantastic. Okay, so we're going to go through each session and talk about some trends and give some updates, starting with session 1. We saw a lot of optimism and skepticism in the discussion boards in session 1. Perhaps you're like Julianne, and the more you use AI, the more ideas you get for its uses. Or maybe you're more like Melanie, who wonders if we'll ever see anything real in the future. Next slide. Thinking about what we've learned the past 6 months in the research, we find that our students also have a lot of optimism and skepticism like we do. They see AI as being a motivator for language learning by providing scaffolding through personalized support, where they ask AI to fill in gaps in their knowledge to help them successfully complete tasks, as well as a learning partner to provide confirmation of their ideas. Students are also worried about AI providing inaccurate information. And something that was really surprising to me was some students lose their self-confidence when using AI as a writing editor when they see it can complete the work better than they could. And this to me highlights how important it is for us as teachers to help students navigate Gen AI. Over to you, Jeff.
And you know, something that definitely showed up in session number 1 is that idea of technology is always changing, right? And I think, you know, Gary Foreman posted in there, and we can all attest to this, that we have a closet full of technology that was going to, you know, save the world and change our classrooms. But ultimately, you know, it just got worked into our ways of doing things. And I think, you know, this idea of how to handle new technology kind of summed up really well by Mina Gavel, who said, maybe it's time to create an age-related digital incompetence, and says, no, you know, we got to keep learning. And I think that's true. You know, AI can seem kind of overwhelming at the start. We saw a bit of that in session 1, but, you know, stepping up and saying, well, how do we approach this? And to that, we can kind of go back to some classic works of educational theory. So if we jump to the next slide here, one of the things we saw, that digital native, digital immigrant popped up in the session 1 comments. And, you know, Mark Prensky, who wrote that, has even stepped back from that and really kind of, you know, reframed it as, don't think of that as you're one or the other, but think of how you approach technology. Do you just kind of jump into the culture and learn as you go? And this is kind of backed up with something that Mizuki Ito, or Mimi Ito, and her colleagues published back in 2013, I believe it was, Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out, where the way younger people, you know, we call it the digital natives, so to speak, learn technology is they'll jump into a whole bunch of different technologies, 10, 12 different technologies. They'll pare that down to about half of that, about 5 or 6, and really start to play with them and understand how they function. And they'll pick 1 or 2 of those and develop mastery in it. And then once they've kind of developed mastery, and the circle will go back. They'll go out and pick out new technologies in a different area. And we encourage you to do the same thing. Kind of, you know, jump into everything, mess with it, but you don't have to be an expert in any of it. Find what works for you, find what works for your classes. Lots of great examples in the comments of people sharing, hey, this tool works for me, this tool works for my students. But don't try to master all of it. Just try to master what's best. So that was session 1. We'll go to session 2 now.
Yeah, so in session 2, one of the things we saw was that a lot of postings about how Gen AI supports traditional teaching methods. So Eric here highlighted how Gen AI can potentially be used to save time in creating more traditional pen and paper type tasks. And Anne indicated how they were not worried. They were not worried, not wowed by Gen AI in the same way as other emerging technologies that have come out. Next slide. So as we're thinking about trying to use Gen AI in more innovative ways beyond traditional teaching methods, we can keep in mind recommendations that students have made in recent research that are listed here in the order of importance students placed on each recommendation. These include making sure its use is language focused, that is, it's supporting language learning. Students also want clear guidelines for the use of AI, and they want learner training on how to use it. And right here, I want to put a little plug in for session 6, where we outline one way you can incorporate learner training. So be on the lookout for that in that session. Students also want us to have positive attitudes about emerging technologies. This doesn't mean that we aren't critical in its use, but it shows how important we are as a bridge between students and Gen AI, which is what I said the first time. So this is becoming a recurring theme. Over to you, Jeff.
Something else we saw over in session 2 was talking about these frameworks, and we're really happy to see all the different ways people approach these frameworks, what they thought worked best. And I think this is something where Courtney Cunningham in Group A, I believe it is, summed it up really well of just like, hey, this really forced me to take a deeper look at a tool that I was going to use. And especially as we're on the back end of session 3 with talking about privacy and its implications, kind of doing some deep dives into tools is really great to see amongst everybody. And I think that Heidi Fredrickson summed it up really well too, in saying that like sometimes the depth that we can go into with these frameworks can be a back burner because we're just so busy. And I think that's a big takeaway from session 2 that we saw amongst all the communication is, how do you want to approach this when we're evaluating a piece of software? And so, 2 of the things that I like to do, and I've seen people mention it in the chat as well, if we jump over to the next slide, is, are we going with breadth or depth? And so, if I'm looking for a piece of technology just for a unit or a lesson in my classroom, I use something super basic like the bandwidth immediacy framework, right? What's the internet cost of that tool that I'm going to use? Video conferencing, high internet bandwidth, high cost. Images or text messages, super cheap in internet cost. And so, for something that's really, it's a one-time use or a couple of classes, I'm going to do something like that. Whereas, Elizabeth shared with us that comprehensive call resource evaluation, which is incredibly deep. If I'm going to do an evaluation for my entire program, or we're deciding for our university what kind of software to use, a much more valuable tool to use to go very granular, because we're going to use it as an enterprise solution. So how do we want to think about that? And I think it's really great to see that in the session 2 of how everybody's evaluating these tools based on their individual uses.
Now on to session 3. So when in session 3, I saw a lot of critical consumers of AI. So Tim wondered if we're only using AI to enhance our teaching, is it worth it given privacy and bias concerns? And Jane highlighted how we can potentially be entering a new information phase where bias might thrive. I think those are really valid concerns. We talked a lot about the bias in images within the discussion boards. Can we go to the next slide? I want to highlight here one of the most interesting studies I've read in the past month. So most of us are familiar with differences in Englishes around the world that have different conventions, including vocabulary, like the word jumper, which has different meanings in different Englishes. What we're finding is writing suggestions from AI have a more Western-centric focus. This makes it so that students in non-Western countries need to modify AI text in order to have it be reflective of their own voice and culture. When I read this, I wondered if that bias extends to the possibility that teaching recommendations are also reflective of Western ideals of what a classroom looks like. So let's hear from Jeff.
Yeah, and going into that, with session 3, it could have been really easy to kind of think about just, hey, the privacy implications are too much to use AI or things like that. But there was a lot of sort of positivity in there as well. And I think as language educators, naturally we're inclined to think about bias. And something I thought, Jennifer Atkins pointed out that was really on point is that, hey, this is a tool and we can invent how we use it sometimes. And I think there's that idea that we can actually, be the people who manipulate these tools and actually get them to reflect the diversity that we want to see. And we can advocate for more privacy as the consumers of these tools. And I think, teachers have to be the forefront of that. And if we're the vanguard, and especially language teachers, because we're sensitive to culture, language is culture, culture is language, right? And, I think another aspect of that too, that we saw in session 3, of course, was the plagiarism part that also got a lot of traction. And, Casey Thornton summed it up really well by saying, like, I had to show teachers that, the AI plagiarism detectors we're using aren't great. So for us, we have to be that informed user group who can actually, defend our students when it comes to these accusations of plagiarism, right? So how do we balance those out? And, lots of ways to stay informed there. I think a great example here is from the University of Kansas. They talk about Turnitin, right? So Turnitin says, hey, we can verify, these conditions, 98% accuracy. We step up and say, those are under controlled conditions in a laboratory. So we have a margin of error only 15 percentage points. We step in and say, hey, that means it could be anywhere from 35 to 65, right? So we can be the ones who kind of counter the corporate talk, so to speak, and really advocate for our students. And same thing with bias. We can think about where we can step in and argue for better representation. And a great link and website that Christine Fiorite, I apologize for getting your name wrong, shared with the group was the Algorithmic Justice League, right? That advocates for, large language models and data sets to better reflect, the worldwide group of people who are going to be using AI, and more importantly, be impacted by AI's use, right? So we got to keep fighting the good fight here, right?
Yeah, so it's now time for us to have some breakout groups for you guys to have talks among yourself about these questions. So you're going to have 15 minutes in your breakout groups. And we have these 2 questions which will be listed in the chat. Has your view of AI and its possible role in the classroom altered since starting the course? If so, how? If not, why? And what ways can we promote the privacy of our students and our teacher students about safe privacy practices in tech use? And when you come back, we'd like you to have one takeaway to share in the chat box. Try to keep it like a concise takeaway so we don't have these really long narratives in the chat box as you are chatting with your students. So I mean, with not your students, oh my gosh, I spend too much time teaching, with your colleagues in the breakout groups. Are we ready? I know I'm ready.
I'll open them now.
Perfect.
All right.
With everybody, and welcome back, everybody. Okay. And then I see already that some people in the chat have started to share some of their main takeaways. So once again, we encourage everybody to share one idea that came up in your conversation. It sounded like they were really rich and deep conversations. So please do feel free to share your reflections in the chat from your breakout group. Great. And I don't know, Jeff and Elizabeth, if you see anything that catches your eye coming in on the chat, please do feel free to highlight anything. Lots coming in.
The Jasmine says that we need free resources for low resource communities and not exasperate. I should pick a different word. Magnifying the digital divide. Yola, thank you for joining us. And hopefully your work is enjoyable, but maybe not as enjoyable as this session.
And I think something else that popped up in the chat that we saw, and Michael Real talks about it there, of just, what is your school policy? And I think it's one of those things of, if we can think about our classroom policy around AI, but, working with, our departments, our programs, or even our institutions to figure out what is, collectively the policy, and get students involved with that. It's something we talk about in the videos coming up. Just how do we make sure everybody's a vocal participant of setting up these new standards for AI? Christy French had a good one about the time saver thing. And I know Elizabeth has comments on the time saver and some research that's just been coming out, but AI is time saver, Elizabeth?
AI is the time saver. Yeah, I mean, it can be, and sometimes it can't be. It depends on how you approach it. I think I said in session 4, I mean, that you have to decide for yourself if it saves time, that it doesn't automatically save you time. And that's how I think you have to approach it. So there's some great research that's been coming out that's showing that the idea of saving time is not true, right? That sometimes it takes more time.
Little preview of session 4.
Elizabeth, can you expand on that just a little bit? Like can you give me an example?
Well, something that I've noticed for me is that using image generators does not save me time, because it takes me so long to generate the image, to say that doesn't work, to try and refine my prompt, to get what I'm looking for, and then to use an AI editor to then edit the image. And by the time I've done that, I've taken an hour to do what used to take me 20 minutes to search on my existing places that I get images, to edit an image that someone has created and allows me to edit. So that was 20 minutes, but now I'm spending an hour, and the benefit for my students is not actually greater than what I used to use.
I see. Thank you.
Little preview of session 4 there. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for all of these great takeaways in the chat. I want to move us along now to our Q&A, and I invite you all to continue adding questions to the Q&A feature of Zoom, so that we can get a couple more questions in here before the end of our session. But I think, Jeff, I'm just going to ask you a little bit more. It seems like our participants are pretty curious about the course song that you just put together. There was a question about what is copyright on the songs created. So I wonder if you can share any insight on that, or if you have any additional information about that application, so that our participants can take a look and explore it.
Yeah, it right now it's that sticky wicket where nobody quite knows what it is. One of the things that a lot of these sites will say is like, don't use other people's copyrighted work to make your material. But as far as like outputting it, so with the song, and this is where those terms of services become really important. If I jump into the terms of services of Suno AI, chances are they have some form of ownership over my material, right, that I created, because technically it's their software that ran it. So we have to be thinking about that. I create this song. Is it now mine? Do I own it? Or does the company, whose software I use, own it? And those are the sorts of things we have to start looking at. And there's a court case a bit back, or sorry, not a court case, an argument that came up with a photographer who used AI and submitted it into an exhibition and won. And the reaction was pretty strong and swift that it wasn't real artwork. And he said, well, it was, I built it. Nobody knows quite where that conversation is going to land yet. So, and that's why some great websites to check out if you're interested in this kind of stuff. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, or EFF.org, is a great website that advocates for digital rights and privacy. They're a nonprofit, but also keeps track of those kind of cases to let people know, what's the latest news on those.
I was just looking at Suno's Q&A,
Yep.
and I put it in
There it
the
is.
chat that outlines who owns the copyright. And so it looks like it depends on what kind of plan that you have, whether or not the free plan or a pro or a premium, on who owns the copyright, and with lyrics, who wrote the lyrics. So it's not just a simple answer. So
Our song is technically owned by Suno because I have the free plan. So,
and you didn't write the lyrics.
right.
I wrote the lyrics. Yeah.
Really
Now I use
interesting.
your words to write a hit, and Suno makes the money. I have 100 teachers here who are left unpaid and are going to be unhappy with
We're
me.
angry. We want our cut.
There is also another, kind of related question here from Julia Hedges about when using ChatGPT for lesson planning, for example, what citations or attributions are necessary? I wonder if Elizabeth or Jeff, either of you have any insight. Again, I think maybe it might come down to that we're still shaping this, but I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, so there's a lot of debate right now in the research sphere, especially as to whether or not you have to cite your AI use when you are submitting something for publication. And it differs depending on journal, right? So some journals say that you have to have an AI use statement, and some journals say you don't, and some journals say only if it does significant writing. And so I think in terms of if you use it for creating lessons, I think it depends on what it is that you're going to do with that. If you're just going to use the lesson to teach your class, you maybe don't have to say, I used Gen AI to come up with these ideas, because then you're giving your students your teacher talk, and they don't need to hear your teacher talk. But if you're submitting your lesson plans for administration to review them, you might want to disclose that AI helped you to write them, and at what level did AI help you to write them. I don't know, Jeff has any ideas, thoughts?
Once again, yeah, Christy French just posted, OWL, the Purdue website, the OWL website talks about citing AI. So I just dropped the link in the chat here as well. And then Sean Fields mentioned another resource here. University of Maryland has citing AI correctly as well. So, the guidelines are out there, so you can definitely check those links out and see how it works.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And then you just have to decide, do I have to cite it now that I know how?
And I think, maybe this is one of the things that, we're going to see kind of moving forward with AI is right now, we're using it to get information, but it's slowly turning into a search engine. And ChatGPT just announced OpenAI announced their search engine capabilities coming up of this idea of, right now we're using this collective mind of 100 people to crowdsource all this information on AI. But at what point do we just ask, the AI, and it goes out on the internet and fetches that and brings it back? That'll be, I think, when we really see the use of AI start to explode, when it can just start answering questions for us in ways that right now it's just not possible to do.
Really interesting. Thank you so much. There's so much up for debate with this constantly developing technology. There is an interesting question, and perhaps I'm wondering also what you think. Heidi DeMello is asking about how AI has changed the field of corpus linguistics, and I think this kind of ties into some of the concepts that you introduced in session 1, Jeff, just about how generative AI works. Do you have any insight on that?
I keep shrugging at all the questions. I think it's just because it's all so new. And I think that's one of the cool parts about, being language teachers when we approach AI is, it can seem very, kind of mysterious at the front, but every time a language teacher starts to unpack like the large language model that runs AI, it's like, oh, this is just a corpora, right? And so that really, I think, what we're seeing is just, what language educators or linguists, used back in the day to do corpus searching, now just has a much more robust toolkit. And if you really want to dig into the weeds there, there's a great, and I'll post it, a great Google research report on all you need is transformers, right? That's the fundamental work that basically said, hey, we can take these large language data sets and really start to, create artificial intelligence using it. So it's all based on corpora, right? But we haven't seen research as to how, linguistics shaped AI, but now how AI is going to reshape linguistics, we don't know, right? But I also think it kind of, maybe as an aside, it's also bringing up this idea when we talk about, biases and things like that. It's when you have large language models in English that are this big, but you have, this much in Indonesian, there's the problem, or a Khan, or, whatever language it may be. Unfortunately, those smaller data sets mean smaller representation. So how do we, start thinking about, the more content that gets created in languages, the more they're going to be represented in those data sets, the more AI is going to recognize them. And I think, linguists and language teachers have a big part to play in how do we make that happen, right? I don't know.
Well, then, one thing that's really important, though, to note that even though you might feed into a model another language, the model is always going to be better at whatever language it was built on. So the only way to really create equitable situations is to build models in these languages, not just feed these languages into models that are built in English or Chinese. There's a lot of Chinese models out there.
And Byrne just asked in the chat, will this session become part of the training set to train AI? And the question is probably, Zoom has rules around how it can use your data. And I know they got in a bit of hot water last year by saying, hey, anything you put in Zoom is going to be used for training purposes. And then they had to backpedal a little bit. And that's the thing. It's now data is it. So whether you're using Microsoft Teams or Zoom, Google Docs, things like that, it's all being used. So, be careful what you put in there, right? And I think this kind of goes into something maybe we'll talk about at the end of the course webinar. But I think one of the futures we can start to see is this development of miniature or small, custom or bespoke AI models that are just trained on just your data. And I think that can be a really powerful way to kind of move forward, where we're only sharing with it, my research work, right? And it can help me write better papers in the future. I think that would be an exciting area to develop. So we're looking through the chat here.
Yeah. I also see there's an interesting question about energy use that Susan posted. Are some chatbots greener, quote unquote, in terms of energy use than others? I mean, that's a whole nother layer of the ethical concerns we've been talking about. Yeah.
Who gave me some great advice when on session 3, she's like, hey, my whole SMC could have been doom and gloom on environmentalism, but she didn't.
Yeah. So some companies are trying to be greener, right? So their models still take as much electricity, as much water, but they're trying to use renewable energy. They're trying to be a little bit more environmentally conscious.
But they're also seeing it's very profitable. So I know Microsoft, because their AI growth has slipped on their carbon neutral goals. Facebook and Google are both trying to buy nuclear reactors to power their data centers. So I think a lot of companies promise a lot of carbon neutrality, and then after they've seen the explosion of AI, because some of these data centers are using the same power as the entirety of Salt Lake City, right? Those sorts of big numbers. So it can be really tricky, right? So, again, when you look at an AI, go check out the company and look at their reports, look at their commitments to sustainability, those commitments prior to AI and now AI, and see if they've changed, right?
Thank you so much for that answer. There are a lot of great questions that have come through, and I'm sorry we're not getting to to all of them. I do want to note we are almost at the end of our hour, so I want to invite participants to stay on if they would like to continue this conversation, to continue the Q&A. But I want to just give a couple of updates, and I know there are some kind of housekeeping questions that have come up before we continue our conversation. So just noting that these are, session 4 just came out, so you should be able to access that on the course. There were some issues for a few of you in accessing that, so please, just if you are having trouble getting into session 4, most likely all you need to do is just go back to the mid-course webinar page and click through that so that the course realizes that you've made it through that step to get you into session 4. And then we'll be looking forward to session 5 next week and session 6 after that. We'll have a final webinar on December 11th, and we'll share the link to that in the chat. And your final assignment will be due on Friday, December 13th. Please reach out to us at courses at yaleprograms.org if you are having if you have any questions or issues. I know some of you have questions maybe about your final project. Do feel free to email us at courses@yaleprograms.org. And start thinking about that assignment now. Really, all of the discussion prompts throughout the course are meant to get you to a place where you're ready to complete that action plan. A recording of this webinar will be available, and I've seen a lot of chatter about your interest in having all of the chat comments from this webinar. So I will be sure to share some of the highlights of the chat so that you can reference it later on as well as the webinar recording. And also I saw a recommendation that you would love to get a compendium of all of the resources that your colleagues have brought up in the course on the discussion boards. And that is something that I think is a great idea. And we're going to look into that and see how we can deliver that to you so you can easily reference it in the future. On that note, just wanted to note that the fellow application is currently open. Alumni are our best recruiters, so please be sure to spread the word about the fellow application. It's open for 25, 26 projects that would be starting next year. The priority deadline is December 31st, 2024, so please be sure to spread the word. And on that note, I know many of you may have something to move on to in your busy lives. So I want to thank you all for coming and invite anyone who would like to stay on for another 15 minutes or so to hang out and continue the conversation with Elizabeth and Jeff.
Great. Let's look at the questions and see what we have. There was a question early on by Nancy, and she said, I wondered why this week's video constantly addressed the AI bots as you when you were told to avoid using personal pronouns with bots. And it's a really good point. I went back and I looked at the video, and it's when in the prompting, when you're prompting the AI, right, that we're using. And Jeff said, when we're talking about the AI, we refer to it as it. It's really hard to prompt AI without using you. And that's why when you're prompting AI, you're using you. So if people have recommendations for how you can prompt AI without using you and without using a lot of words, because we don't want to like replace you with a huge string of words, put those in the chat so that we can all try and reduce our use of you in the prompt. But especially when I'm working with students, I don't necessarily want to use a whole lot of words in the prompts that I'm giving students to use to chat, because I typically teach beginning classes. And so if I give them these prompts with all these long words, they try to translate every word. So that's one of the reasons why I use you in the prompts.
Yeah, I think Stephanie has a great comment there in the chat, just like using a lot of imperatives, right? Give me 10 vocabulary terms, make them one level easier. It's kind of like just direct prompts can also be super helpful.
Yeah, those are great suggestions, Stephanie.
But Byrne brings it up too. It's the way AI is made to sound very casual, to establish that friendly relationship, is, it's easy to start talking to it like it's real, right? Anthropomorphizing it is what we do.
Yeah, Tristan brings up a really good point. I love when you get research. So Tristan and you and I love that research. He says there's research that AI gives better results when you add emotion. And I would be really interested to see that research.
And next year it's going to be, that we'll see that, research all start coming out as people had a chance to really kind of explore, AI out in the wild. Because we saw those white papers and things come out when a lot of this was under wraps in like 2023, but it's only been like this year that we've been able to get real research from educators about, its use and its impacts.
Yeah.
I have my hand up. Talaba. I have my hand up.
Yeah. There
Yes.
You go. Oh, there you are.
Hi. I have my hand up. In general, I would like to, number one, I really appreciate having these conversations with my colleagues. And I would request that we have these conversations more often, no matter what the issue is, because I felt very supported. And this is the first time I've had this experience with the ELP program bringing us together to discuss these issues. I also don't want us to color over or forget about the aspect of culture and the use of technology and what is available visually for our students as to who represents what. So I would really like, and this was an issue during my fellowship. I don't look like an American, whatever that means. And, got a lot of resistance that I was a fellow. So I would like to add to your list of courses to really focus on, we're working in a global, diverse student body, countries that we're in. And how can we be those ambassadors, those public diplomats, and also teach and explore and expand people's ideas, not only as far as national identity, but social identity, level of education, because sometimes these things are a barrier, can be a barrier. And I have students who, until they get to know me and trust me, are afraid to ask me because I'm the authority. Whereas the American, values and belief system is we're all learning together. So these are some of the nuances, of culture that we often kind of introduce, but we skip over. And I'd like to contact and talk to someone about maybe doing a separate class for anyone who's interested. I don't know how you choose classes, but I really think it's necessary, when we're doing these cultural exchange, that we're aware of what we're bringing just by showing up and who we're working with and how we choose our materials and our curriculum and that kind of thing. So that's just a suggestion.
Yeah, and I know there was it was a group C. I'll go back and look. There's a great discussion going on in the comments about how, sometimes the books will overemphasize an area and it doesn't necessarily reflect reality. And then, how do we balance that out with what we bring into the class? How do we make meaningful choices to, with images and texts and readings in our classes? And it's a whole area, we really need to unpack, because like you say, it's like, what's an American? Everybody, we're such a, in theory, right? In practice, it's a very complicated question. And so, our students are looking at us to have those conversations, but are we prepared to have them, right? The more we can talk together, the better. It's an area we need work in, right? I don't know if Elizabeth has anything to add to that.
I don't. It's a really important topic, and you told the team that needs to be told, and I am sure that they will note it down and consider it as they're making choices. Pulling another question from our Q&A, Michael Ryal asks, Gen AI tools must cost money. How much could we expect to pay for a subscription? And this is a really good question. It depends on the kind of AI and on the company, but they range anywhere from $10 a month to $50 a month. I saw one the other day that was $90 a month. So there really isn't an expect to pay. On average, I think most text-based models cost in the $20-ish per month. But you can get a lot of free access. It's limited in how much you can get. The models aren't as strong and powerful, but for a lot of the things that we do, they do provide a lot of meaning and help. So, and I see
Yeah.
Laura has her hand. Oh, Jeff, did you have? Sorry, I didn't want to cut you
No,
off.
yeah, about 20 bucks a month. And I try to get by on all the free things just as like a challenge to be like, when I talk about these things, I want to be able to talk about the things that everybody can access. So I tend not to subscribe to any of the, the paid versions, because I go out in the field and show something and I was like, great, that I can't afford that. So, I've gotten a lot out of Gemini, Google Gemini, without having to pay. And, Chat GPT's, basic version can do a lot of what we need. Sorry.
That's great. I'd love to hear, sorry, Elizabeth, were you going to add more to that or no? Okay. Laura, did you want to jump in with your question, Laura?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you staying on a little longer. I'm full of questions. Talaba, I just wanted to say you look like a U.S. educator to me. So, I maybe this goes without saying, I'm so new to the AI world, but I worked for a disability law center for many years. And every time I see student privacy, I think to myself, gosh, if I was back in Columbia where I taught for a year, I would have a team of people around me saying, tell us what the policy is, right? Like, I don't think as educators, I should be solo in deciding that. And I would actually love to have the institution put those parameters out, because this is endless, right? Like, I would hope that it would be at least a team of people in the institution that would be saying, these are the parameters that we're going to have about using AI. And then I don't have to be the one to be talking to my students directly about their privacy. That just makes me shiver a little bit. I want to do that in a collaborative team, right? And am I saying what is already happening and I just don't know it? Or
Well, I mean, some institutions do have policies and some of them don't. And
right.
I think you've highlighted that, yeah, maybe yours doesn't. My institution does have policies around
Great.
AI use. One of my institutions, my other institution doesn't really have a policy because they want teachers to be able to be innovative and not to feel like they're constrained with what they can and can't do in their classroom. And so that's one of the, I mean, once you institute a policy, then you're maybe squashing some innovation and creativity, but you maybe are protecting privacy and finding that balance between those. But yeah, I think regardless of whether or not your institution has a policy or not, you still are in a place where you should be teaching your students about privacy if you're using technology in your
for
classroom.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I wouldn't want to be that person that again, seen as the authority figure when it's changing and developing. And I'd want to be with a group of people who all said, we are the folks who are reviewing these things, and we're going to get together every 6 months with our IT people and give you the student, give you some guidelines. So thanks. It's not a crazy question then, huh?
No.
And everyone's figuring it out. I recently had a bit of a tough conversation at my university, mentioning I was uncomfortable with how feet first we were jumping into AI, and one of the leaders was talking about, I said, AI can copy work, and they said, well, if I go to a museum and I feel inspired by Van Gogh and go home and paint a Van Gogh, that's not really stealing. And I said, well, but you can't make 10,000 of them a minute. And companies are now looking at that as a way to cut costs with art when game development and animation and things like that. We're graduating students in those careers, so we can't wholeheartedly
Right.
embrace this thing and take their money at the same time. So, where are we going to sit? And I think it's a really tough question for big institutions to think about. But I know a few people have mentioned in the chat, like getting working groups together. And I think it's really easy for big institutions to go, okay, let's go to computer science and get some people. Let's go to business and get some people. Language teachers need to be in that room, because we understand, what Talba and other people have mentioned already. The cultural component of this also needs to be recognized, and we're at the forefront of language and
sociologists have
culture.
to be in the room too.
Exactly. So at least be an advocate for getting the liberal arts, people in the room with these conversations, because
Right.
we're desperately needed, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
I really like this question that came through. It's with artificial intelligence having a huge driving force on humanity, what happens with or to real intelligence? Is there such a thing? Does it become obsolete? And I don't think it does become obsolete. And what I like about this question, actually, something I was working on yesterday, they were talking about using chatbots to help students practice their English, and how to give students prompts so that they can use general chatbots to practice their English. And one of the things that that we talked about, that we asked about, is does this mean that students are going to start to mimic AI language in the way that they talk? Because they're going to start using AI as their speaking partner, and then they're going to start using those conventions. Does that eliminate sort of individual students' voices, or sort of the language that we build in our classrooms as we explore and develop it? And I don't think it does, because we still are going to have individual creativity. Like, our desires as humans to create is not going to go away just because AI is there. We still want to be individuals. I think what is maybe potentially going to happen is that we're going to be able to start to distinguish between people who maybe are being supported by AI and are okay, and people who are being supported by AI and are really fantastic and skilled. So if I am a graphic designer, which I'm not a graphic designer, and I use AI, I'm going to be able to create better pictures than someone who's not a graphic designer. So my work is going to be better than someone who's not. And I think we're going to be able to see that and take notice of that.
Here we are, webinar after hours. So I'm a little more cavalier, I suppose. I don't want AI making art for me. I want it to do my taxes. Like, take my boring work so I can do the fun stuff. It's like, and I think unfortunately, we're seeing AI can make music, and it can. That's what brings us all joy. How about it does the things that don't bring us joy? As soon as it can do laundry, game on. I'm all about AI.
Me too. I wanted to do my laundry. Oh.
Well, thank you so much for all of your really, insightful answers to all of these questions. I think the conversation could just go on forever. And thanks for all the great questions, in addition to Jeff and Elizabeth's responses. But these questions are really thought-provoking, and we have a really wonderful community. So thank you for attending today. And we are almost 20 minutes past the hour. So I'd say time for us to wrap up. Thank you for attending, and enjoy the rest of the course. We hope to see you at the final webinar.